Hey, this is another stuchiu story. This one is going to be about the IBP Masters tournament that's coming up this weekend. It's a smaller land with mostly NA teams, but there's also Renegades and Luminosity. The big story will likely be Cloud9 versus Team Liquid at some point. They're two of the top teams in the world right now, and they have yet to meet in a head to head clash on land, so that should be interesting. But what I wanted to talk about is the Optic reunion that's happening at this tournament because the Optic lineup that won E League Season 2 last year and all the different players that have participated in that lineup, for some reason, they're all here. So I just thought it'd be a good time to reminisce about that story arc just because this book ends everything that happened because all those old Optic players except for Mixwell have gone on to different teams. So I'll start off with when the lineup forms, and that's generally around the time uh, of Conquest, where you get Daps, Naf, Rush, Shazam, and I think Rix was the fifth, and then later on they get Stanislaw instead of Rix, and it ends up being a pretty good team. They're decent online. They get better over time, and Hex sees something in this team, so he hires them to be his squad. And their first LAN tournament is the Clash for Cash at Vegas. It's the first E League broadcast from what I remember, and they were playing against Lounge Gaming. So they play against each other. I'm pretty sure it's a seed for E League, and Lounge Gaming were favored to win. They were the second best Polish team. In terms of skill, they were probably a bit higher. In terms of map pool, they had a good edge against Optic, but Optic ended up winning 2-0. And then the games were all right, but what was most memorable was obviously the Thornburn against Shaq. But after that, you would think like the team showed some promise here. You would think they build on that, but no, it kind of just implodes immediately. Like there was like a bunch of online qualifiers where like they didn't show up, or there was like a huge like drama around it, and it all ends with Shazam getting kicked, and they bring on Mixwell, and this is a great pickup for the team. Mixwell ends up being their best player. He's the primary op for the team, even though he hates the op, and he is currently the only player on Optic from that team that's still on Optic right now, which is sort of funny because there have been a bunch of rumors that he wanted to go back home, he wanted to switch teams, but every single time, the fans convinced him to stay, so here he is. Right. So this new lineup with Daps, Stanislaw, Rush, Naf, Mixwell, it's pretty good. It's strange just because it went against the grain of the other up and coming NA teams in the fact that there was a system, there were tactics. Obviously, Daps seemed like a guy we know now that I can build a system, run a system. It's not like the most complicated shit in the world, but it works. It's effective. And their best feat with this particular five-man lineup is probably the American Miners, where they beat Temple Storm, the Brazilian squad, with Henny, Lucas, Showtime, Bolts, and Phelps. So it was pretty good, but I'd have to say, and I think they realized this eventually, that there was a hard cap limit on how far they could go with the talent they had. They needed more firepower, and the guy they went to ended up being Tarek. And Tarek at the time was stuck in CLG jail. His buyout was too big, so nobody wanted to get him. This is where Optic comes in. And he was about to become a streamer, actually, until his contract ran out, but ended up that Optic was willing to buy him. So they did. And this is where things get weird again for this team. Tarek comes in, and the idea for the team is, okay, we will make it more skilled, so we'll remove Stanislaw, who I thought was the better, among the best supportive type players in NA at the time. And you remove Stanislaw, so you have a Tarek, Naf, Rush, Mixwell, and Daps. And then some weird thing happens where like they take Daps out, they put Stanislaw in. No, they switch back. They switch it back again, or something weird like that. But what ends up happening is Stanislaw eventually becomes the in-game leader of the team, and it's a surprising move because, as far as anybody else knows, Stanislaw was never an in-game leader. Like apparently he did do some of it earlier on in his career, but never at this level. But this move that Tarek does ends up being an important move, just because this is the key in which Optic eventually becomes a top class team. As for Tarek himself, it was a slightly conflicted response as to whether or not he'd be good for this team, just because before that he was on CLG, and CLG was another top NA team. Had pretty decent international results overall, considering their lineups they had, and Tarek was their most skilled player. But the problem with Tarek was he was very dominant online and in NA domestically, but he could never bring it to the international events. So it was kind of a question there, and then the fact that like he kind of dropped off in motivation because of the whole CLG contract buyout thing. It was kind of iffy as to how they wanted to go, how it would turn out for Optic. But if you look at it from Optic's point of view, like despite all of that, he was still a better player than any of the Optic guys minus Mixwell. So ended up being a good choice. This team didn't kick off immediately. I'd say it took them 1 to 2 months to start showing something good. ESL New York, they played there. It was one of the first Swiss systems, and they showed surprisingly decent games. I'd have to say they lost out in the group stages. It was to SK, Fnatic, and Virtus.pro, but they beat G2, and this is the Shock Scream iteration. It was on the downfall for the Shock Scream iteration, but it was still decent team, pretty good I'd say. And then the Astralis iteration with Kerrigan, where they had the internal issues of how do we fit KRB into this team, and also the leadership conflicts between Kerrigan and the rest of the team, and how they wanted to run the team. So it was a good result for Optic, I'd say, despite losing out in group stages. Their next tournament is a month later. It's Northern Arena in Montreal, and they win this one, and it's over Heroic and G2 again. And Heroic was obviously the Danish lineup that had Glaive in it with Modi, Snappy, Valde, and Freeze. I think it was Freeze at the time. It was a surprising result from Optic. It showed more promise than the other one. Obviously, have to say like G2 Shocks and G2 at the time was basically live or die by Shocks and Scream, and while those two were pretty good, those two were good. Like they weren't like monstrous as they were even just like a few months back, and obviously Smiths was doing especially bad at the time. So it was a good result, but it wasn't as impressive as it might look now, I guess. And then after that, you would think Optic are on the rise, but then they go to DreamHack Winter and then they bomb out. And this is actually part of why like Wallaby Beetle calls this the uncertainty era, because you don't really know who's going to win or who's going to lose. It's not like everybody can win and it's super close among the top teams. It's more like teams rise and fall rapidly, and you don't really there's no like consistency among a majority of the teams that are rising and falling, and this is an example of that, because Optic, they win Montreal, then they bomb out of DreamHack Winter. Next tournament is E-League, and then they win the entire thing. And E-League kind of reveals like the peak of what this Optic lineup could do. They had incredible T-sides. Stanislaw was a great lurker, and what they did was they had this very stormy style with Rush as the entry fragger, and Rush was amazing at this point. I'd say he was the best NA player at that time, and just because of how good he was in his particular role and how he enables his entire team, it gave them so much space, and he could like just take over an entire round. You also have to say Naf had like the best game of his life against Astralis, and that's one of the reasons why they ended up winning that tournament. Following tournament, they got second, still a good result. It's at ECS Season 2, and you're thinking, okay, probably a top 3, top 4 team along with Virtus.pro or Astralis. But unfortunately for them, they go to the E-League Major and they draw Virtus.pro round 1. Then they draw like Astralis, and then they eventually get knocked out. So it was a really tough draw. But at the same time, there were already like internal issues with this team going on. And then Stanislaw does like the heel face turn and joins Liquid. And he doesn't really explain it at the time. It's like, Was it really internal issues? Because if you think about it, Optic might have internal issues, but Liquid was infamous for having internal problems, right? So it doesn't seem like that would be the right reason to switch teams. But from later interviews, months after the fact, Stanislav basically says he believed Optic wasn't going to change teams. They probably weren't if that five man lineup stayed together. They probably weren't going to change rosters, and he felt like that roster had maxed out its potential. It probably had, to be fair to Stanislaw. And he also thought that if he joined Liquid, there was so much potential on that team, he could probably like get it to where it needed to go and get even higher results eventually. He turned out to be right, but obviously Liquid themselves had to bring on two different things: Zeus as coach, Twist as star, and then they had to switch all of the roles up in order to get the entire thing functioning. Eventually, with Stanislaw dropping in-game leading to become the second caller. But in a sense, Stanislaw was right, and Liquid right now is a better team than Optic was back then. So that's basically how Stanislaw gets to IBP Power Masters with Team Liquid, one of the better teams in the world, and a team I think should be able to compete for a championship. Though we'll have to see. I feel like they have to get through. They have to beat more of these top teams, I guess. Obviously. So we'll see. We'll see on that front. So what happens with the rest of the team at this time? So basically, Mixwell, Tarek, Naf, Rush, they think to themselves probably that we're a good team. We did win a fucking tournament with like 4 out of the 5 people here, so we just need to get for the right fifth. They never did get that right fifth, and they were so much worse than they were without Stanislaw, and nobody could really explain why. And like even when you look like in the past when like teams did this, like for instance like the Fnatic lineup where they dropped Pronax to get Dennis, yeah, like it gets looser, but it's not like they dropped everything they learned from Pronax. But when Stanislaw left, it's like nothing Stanislaw did was like remembered in this team for whatever reason. So it never really worked out for them. They tried getting Peacemaker, they tried getting Hiko, Jason R, Hazed. Like nothing really worked. And strangely, the last bit of the run at ESL Cologne, they had Tarek do the in-game leading, and that was probably their best. That was their best run with this like 4-man plus whichever extra person they had at the time lineup. And Tarek as a leader, I am a pet, basically says he wasn't that good at setting up the initial rounds, but he was good at the mid round and adapting. So that's why and more importantly, he wanted to be leader, so it worked out that way. And so even though they had a good result near the end, it's kind of clear that to everybody in this lineup that their chances are gone. Like there is no like magical fifth that will show up and save this team. So Tarek and Rush move on to Cloud9 because Cloud9 happened to open up, and then Cloud9 themselves obviously have like a question of identity moving forward, just because they have 2 in-game leaders in Stewie 2K and Tarek. Technically 3 if you want to count automatic. Then they have like a bunch of entry guys like Rush, Stewie, Tarek. Like, and then they had a bunch of like secondary oppers, Tarek, Stewie. Like there are a bunch of there's a bunch of weird configurations you could have put this team into, and we'll have to see if they go with the current iteration right now. But basically Tarek's now the in-game leader of that team, and that team's that Cloud9's already having more success, I think. Well, I won't say more success, but it feels like their potential and their peak looks to be higher than what the previous Cloud9 roster was. And as for the guys left over, Mixwell, he decides to stay with Optic, and then they get like a hodgepodge of the leftover skilled players from EU and build a team around him. Includes Alu, Freiburg, Magisk, and HS, I think was the 5th. As for Naf, he goes on to Renegades. Basically becomes like their star player, and recently they just beat Virtus Pro at Star Ladder to win that tournament. And to round it out, Shazam, like he was the first guy kicked. He eventually moved on to Misfits, and now he's at this tournament. And Misfits themselves seem to be on the rise. They beat TL and CLG to qualify for the major qualifier. As for Daps, he moved on to eventually NRG. Played there for a bit as their in-game leader. Was eventually bench, and then became coach. But just today it was announced he came back again, so it's kind of like a weird echo to what happened to that Stanislav situation. Stanislav Tarek situation back when Tarek joined Optic. So that's kind of weird. But basically, everybody from Optic has shown up to this IBP Masters tournament. It's basically an Optic reunion. It bookends like that entire roster as they've all gone to different places now. So I just thought it was a nice little jog down memory lane as the tournament starts. All right, I'll see you later.